There was something unsettling about the way the wind howled through the dense pines that framed the single dirt road into Whispering Pines. The sign welcoming visitors was rusted and barely legible, its chipped paint clinging to the name as though unwilling to let it fade completely. As the friend's car rolled over the uneven terrain, the crunch of gravel under the tires was the only sound for miles, save for the occasional rustle of branches swaying above. Mia, the self-appointed leader of the group, leaned forward from the passenger seat, her eyes scanning the horizon for their rented cabin. "It's supposed to be a little rustic," she said, her voice holding an edge of nervousness. "But the pictures made it look cozy." "Rustic?" Jake, her brother, smirked as he kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel. "This place looks like it hasn't seen a tourist since the 80s. Did you check to see if it has Wi-Fi?" "I thought the whole point was to disconnect," chimed in Clara from the back seat. Her face was pressed against the window, staring at the endless trees that seemed to loom closer the deeper they drove. "I think it's kind of charming. Quiet. Peaceful." Beside her, Ethan shifted uneasily. "Peaceful? This place looks like the start of every horror movie ever. Next thing you know, some old man's gonna warn us about staying here." As if on cue, the car jolted to a stop in front of the cabin, a weathered structure with peeling paint and a porch that sagged like it was sighing under the weight of its years. Standing just beyond the clearing was a figure in a wide-brimmed hat, their silhouette almost blending into the surrounding shadows. "Okay, that's creepy," Ethan muttered, his earlier joke now feeling less humorous. "Relax," Mia said, though her voice lacked conviction. She climbed out of the car, straightening her jacket against the sudden chill in the air. "It's probably the property caretaker. I'll go talk to him." The others watched as she approached the figure, her footsteps crunching loudly in the eerie silence. The man, if he could be called that, was hunched and motionless. His clothes were ragged, and the hat obscured most of his face. When Mia greeted him, he lifted his head just enough to reveal pale, glassy eyes that seemed to stare through her. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice a low rasp that seemed to carry on the wind. "What?" Mia asked, taking a step back. "This place isn't for you," the man continued, his lips barely moving. "Leave before the forest takes you." Without waiting for a response, he turned and shuffled into the trees, disappearing as though the shadows had swallowed him whole. When Mia returned to the group, her face was pale, but she forced a smile. "Just a weird local," she said, waving it off. "Nothing to worry about." As they unloaded their bags and stepped inside the cabin, the air felt heavier. The interior was exactly as promised, rustic and unassuming, with mismatched furniture and the faint scent of pine. Yet, there was a peculiar stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Later that evening, after unpacking and attempting to shake off the encounter with the stranger, the group gathered on the porch to watch the sun set over the lake. The water shimmered under the fading light, but the beauty was marred by an oppressive quiet. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed. It was a silence so deep it felt unnatural. "Is it just me?" Clara whispered. "Or does it feel like we're being watched?" The others laughed nervously, brushing off her comment as paranoia. But as the darkness settled in, each of them felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of their necks, a weight in the air that refused to lift. Whispering Pines had welcomed them, but it wasn't the kind of welcome that promised safety. Inside, the glass windows reflected the flickering light of their lanterns. For a moment, Mia thought she saw movement in the reflection, something shifting in the trees just beyond the porch. But when she turned to look, the forest was still, the shadows stretching endlessly into the night. She shook her head and laughed to herself, trying to dismiss the unease. But deep down, she knew this weekend was going to be anything but peaceful. Morning in Whispering Pines arrived slowly, the light filtering through the dense canopy of trees as though reluctant to reach the ground. The air was cool, carrying a faint, metallic tang that none of the friends could quite place. As they gathered in the small kitchen for breakfast, the tension from the previous night lingered like the scent of smoke after a fire. "Did anyone else hear that weird noise last night?" Clara asked, breaking the silence. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her eyes fixed on the window. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You mean the nothing? No frogs, no crickets, no owls. This place is unnervingly quiet. It's like the forest forgot how to be alive. No, Clara said, shaking her head. It wasn't silence. It was a scratching sound, like something was trying to get in. Jake snorted, shoving a forkful of eggs into his mouth. Probably just a raccoon or a tree branch scraping the cabin. Nothing to freak out over. Mia, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, glanced at Clara. I heard it too, around midnight. I thought it was the wind, but now, she trailed off, her expression clouding. Okay, let's not start the day with ghost stories, Jake said, standing up. We came here to unwind, remember? How about we actually explore the area instead of sitting around scaring ourselves? The suggestion seemed to lighten the mood. After packing some water bottles and snacks, they set out toward the lake, their laughter gradually replacing the earlier unease. The trail was narrow, bordered by tall grass and wildflowers that seemed out of place in such an ominous setting. Yet, as they walked, the strange stillness persisted. When they reached the lake, it was as breathtaking as Mia had promised. Crystal clear water reflecting the cloudless sky, framed by the towering pines. But there was something off about it. The surface of the lake was too still, as though even the wind dared not disturb it. Looks like a postcard, Clara said, though her voice lacked enthusiasm. She dipped her hand into the water and immediately pulled it back. It's freezing, like unnaturally cold for this time of year. Ethan, always the skeptic, rolled his eyes. Mountain lakes are cold. Stop looking for reasons to freak out. As they wandered along the shore, Mia spotted something half buried in the sand. She knelt to pick it up, a rusted locket, its chain tangled with lakeweed. Wiping the grime off the surface, she opened it to reveal a black and white photograph of a young woman. The image was faded, but the woman's expression was unmistakable: terror. Creepy souvenir, Ethan joked, though his grin faltered when Mia didn't laugh. She slipped the locket into her pocket and stood, brushing off her hands. Their return to the cabin was quieter. The air felt heavier again, and each step seemed to echo unnaturally. When they passed an old wooden sign near the trailhead, Mia stopped abruptly. The sign had no words, only crude carvings of symbols she didn't recognize, circles, spirals, and jagged lines that seemed to vibrate with an unspoken menace. Who carves this kind of thing? She murmured. Jake shrugged, locals being weird. Probably just old superstitions, or some bored teenager with a knife. But Mia couldn't shake the feeling that the symbols weren't random. They seemed deliberate, almost like a warning. That night, as they sat around the cabin's small fireplace, Clara brought up the locket. You really shouldn't have kept that, she said. It feels wrong, like it belonged to someone who wouldn't want us here. You're overthinking it, Mia replied, though she avoided meeting Clara's gaze. Outside, the wind began to pick up, whistling through the trees in a high-pitched, mournful tone. For a moment, they all froze listening. Then came the scratching sound again, this time louder, more insistent. Ethan stood and grabbed a flashlight. It's just a raccoon, he said, though his tone was more defensive than reassuring. He opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, shining the light into the darkness. The scratching stopped. What do you see? Jake called from inside. Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he stepped further into the yard, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. There's nothing here, he said, but something feels wrong. As he turned to go back inside, the scratching resumed, this time from inside the walls of the cabin. The scratching continued, persistent and rhythmic, echoing through the cabin like the tap-tap-tap of impatient fingers on wood. Everyone froze, their breaths caught in their throats. Ethan stepped back into the room, shutting the door behind him, his face pale. Okay, he said, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. This place officially has a rodent problem. That doesn't sound like a rodent, Clara whispered, her hands clutching the edge of the couch. It sounds bigger, and it's inside. Let's not jump to conclusions, Jake said, though his voice wavered. He grabbed the flashlight from Ethan and scanned the interior walls. It's an old cabin. Could be anything. A raccoon, maybe even some loose boards shifting in the wind. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. For a moment, no one moved, waiting for it to return. When it didn't, Mia exhaled shakily and stood. "Okay," she said, trying to inject some authority into her voice. "It's probably just the house settling. Let's not scare ourselves over nothing. Tomorrow, we'll find the caretaker and ask him about it. For now, let's get some sleep." Despite her reassurance, no one felt comforted. One by one, they retreated to their rooms, though sleep was elusive. Clara lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling and counting every creak and groan the house made. Ethan propped a chair under his door handle, just in case. Mia sat up in bed, turning the locket over in her hands, her mind replaying the caretaker's warning. "Leave before the forest takes you." Jake, ever the pragmatist, was the first to fall asleep, but his rest was far from peaceful. Around 3 a.m., he bolted upright, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. He could have sworn he'd heard someone whispering his name, a soft, sing-song voice just outside his window. Yet, when he looked, there was nothing but darkness and the faint outline of the trees. Morning came sluggishly, the pale sunlight doing little to chase away the previous night's unease. Over breakfast, the group avoided talking about what had happened, as though saying it out loud would make it more real. Mia broke the silence first. "I think we should check the walls," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "If there's an animal in there, we need to deal with it before it gets worse." Ethan frowned. "And if there's nothing? What then?" "Then we'll at least know," Mia replied, her gaze firm. Reluctantly, they began the search. Armed with flashlights and a sense of growing dread, they inspected every corner of the cabin. At first, everything seemed normal, just old wooden planks, cobwebs, and layers of dust. But when they reached the back wall of the living room, Jake stopped. "Guys," he said, his voice tight, "there's something here." The others crowded around as he pried open a loose panel. Behind it was a small cavity, and within that cavity, a bundle of objects wrapped in brittle fabric. Mia reached in and carefully unfolded the bundle, revealing what looked like personal belongings. A cracked mirror, a child's shoe, and a rusted knife. "Why would someone hide this stuff in the wall?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, they heard a faint sound, like a distant murmur, barely audible. The group exchanged uneasy glances, then followed the noise to its source, the basement door. The door had been locked since they arrived, but now it stood ajar, the faint smell of damp earth wafting up from below. "I'm not going down there," Ethan said, stepping back. "No way." Mia tightened her grip on the flashlight. "We have to. If there's something down there, we need to know." Against their better judgment, they descended the creaking wooden stairs, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The basement was cold and dark, the air thick with the scent of mildew. In the far corner, they spotted something etched into the concrete wall, the same strange symbols they'd seen on the trail sign. And beneath the symbols, smeared in faded red, was a single word: "Stay." The murmur grew louder, transforming into a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from all around them. The flashlight flickered, and Mia's hand trembled as she swept the beam across the room. The light landed on a figure, a shape crouched in the corner, its back turned to them. "Hello," Mia called out, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't move. "Mia, let's go," Clara pleaded, her grip on Mia's arm tightening. But Mia took a step closer. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The figure straightened, its movements unnaturally rigid, and turned to face them. What they saw made every ounce of bravery drain from their bodies. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a blank, featureless expanse of pale skin. And then it spoke. Its voice was a distorted echo, blending their own names into a single, haunting chorus. "Why didn't you leave?" The moment the figure spoke, a thick, suffocating silence settled over the basement. The whispers that had been growing louder suddenly stopped, leaving a chilling void in their wake. For a heartbeat, Mia, Clara, Ethan, and Jake stood frozen, unable to move, as the pale, featureless figure stared at them with unblinking eyes. It was Clara who moved first, grabbing Mia's arm and tugging her back towards the stairs. "We need to leave. Now!" Her voice was tight, barely above a whisper, as though any louder utterance might provoke something far worse. But Mia didn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her breath shallow as she stared at the figure. There was something about it that called to her, something that felt both familiar and foreign. The air in the basement was thick with an oppressive energy, as though the very space around them was alive, breathing in time with their fear. "Mia, please!" Ethan's voice was a sharp plea. He grabbed her by the shoulders and spun her toward the stairs. The flashlight, still clutched in Mia's trembling hand, flickered violently before going out completely, plunging the basement into total darkness. The figure's voice came again, a rasping whisper that seemed to echo from all directions. "You cannot leave." Jake's breath hitched as he turned to climb the stairs, but his foot caught on a loose board. He stumbled, his body crashing to the floor with a loud thud. A shriek tore from Clara's throat as she rushed to help him up, but in the time it took her to reach him, the figure had moved closer. "It's too late." The voice was closer now, surrounding them. The air grew colder, and the oppressive feeling of being watched intensified. They couldn't see the figure, but they could feel it, its presence wrapping around them like a tight, invisible cord. "We have to go now," Ethan said, urgency creeping into his voice. He reached for the basement door, but it slammed shut with a deafening crash. The house groaned under the weight of the sudden force, and the walls seemed to shudder. The figure didn't move, but the shadows in the basement began to stretch and bend, twisting like serpents coming to life. The basement, once just a dark and cold space, now felt like a labyrinth, filled with hidden eyes and unseen dangers. The shadows were alive, and they were closing in. Jake's panic was palpable as he scrambled to his feet. "What is this? What the hell is happening?" His voice cracked as he turned to face Mia, whose face was now pale and locked in a trance-like stare. It was as though she couldn't hear him, couldn't see him. Her eyes were fixated on something that wasn't there. "It's not real," Mia muttered, her voice a hoarse whisper. "This isn't real. It can't be." "Mia, snap out of it," Clara cried, shaking her. "We have to get out of here." But Mia remained motionless, her eyes glassy and unblinking, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. The shadows thickened, and with them came a low, guttural sound, like the rumble of thunder, but with a malice that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. The basement door shuddered violently, as if something was trying to force its way through from the other side. Ethan ran to the door, throwing his shoulder against it in a desperate attempt to break it open. "Move, Mia," he shouted, but she didn't respond. Her lips barely moved as she whispered something under her breath, something they couldn't hear. The shadows seemed to respond to her words, growing longer, twisting, curling toward her as if they recognized her command. In that moment, the ground beneath them trembled. The walls cracked, and the sound of something moving in the walls, scraping, scratching, grew louder, more urgent. Whatever was inside the house, whatever had been hidden from them all this time, was waking up. Finally, with a terrifying crack, the basement door burst open, and they were flooded with a rush of cold air. But the shadows didn't leave. Instead, they followed, creeping up the stairs after them, filling the space with an unnatural darkness that swallowed the light. As they scrambled up the stairs, the figure's voice echoed once more, a disembodied sound that reverberated through their bones. "You are not safe." "It's already here." Jake, Clara, and Ethan reached the top of the stairs, breathless and panicked, but Mia remained frozen in the doorway. Her face was blank, her eyes distant, and her hand outstretched toward the figure still lingering in the basement. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he rushed back down the stairs to grab her. "Mia, please. You have to come with us." But it was too late. Mia's hand closed around the cold air, and when her fingers tightened, the shadows recoiled. In that instant, the walls of the cabin seemed to breathe, the floorboards creaking and shifting as if the house itself had come alive. The temperature dropped drastically, and Mia whispered again, her voice now clear, but laced with something dark. "You can't leave because you were never meant to." The shadows swarmed her, enveloping her in a darkness that wasn't of this world. And in the next breath, Mia vanished. The others could do nothing but stare in horror, too shocked to move. The house, once just a quiet cabin in the woods, had become a prison. The walls held secrets that no one had been meant to uncover. And now, it seemed, the house was ready to claim them all. Mia was gone, swallowed by the darkness without a trace. The shadows had taken her. For a moment, the remaining three stood frozen, staring at the spot where she had been, hoping against hope that she would somehow reappear, that the nightmare would end. But it didn't. The house continued to hum with a terrible energy, as though something ancient and malevolent was stirring beneath the floorboards. Jake was the first to break the silence. His voice trembled barely above a whisper. "What do we do now? We can't just leave her like that." His hands were shaking, his breath ragged. Ethan's face was pale, his mind racing, trying to process the impossible. "We have to find her. We can't just let this go." He turned toward the basement, his feet moving before his mind had fully decided. But Clara stopped him, her grip firm on his arm. "No," she said, her voice low but resolute. "We can't go back down there. We don't know what that thing is or what it wants. Mia's gone, Ethan." "She's..." Her voice cracked, and she looked away, not able to finish the thought. The truth was too much to bear. "We have to try," Ethan insisted, his eyes wild. "We can't just sit here and wait for it to come for us next." But Clara wasn't listening anymore. She was staring at the walls, her mind whirling with the images of the night, of the shadows creeping in, of Mia's voice, empty and strange, just before she disappeared. The whole house felt wrong, like a living thing that had turned on them. Every creak, every gust of wind rattling the windows, only made the sense of impending doom more palpable. "Ethan," Clara said, her voice suddenly clear and sharp, "it's not just Mia we need to worry about. It's the house." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" "This house, it's changing," Clara continued. "It's not just some abandoned cabin. Something's alive here. Something that doesn't want us to leave." Her eyes flicked to the walls, to the cracks in the ceiling, to the long shadows stretching across the floor. "We're trapped." A chill swept over them all. The walls groaned, almost in response to Clara's words, as though the house was aware of their growing fear. It wasn't just the walls that were shifting. It was the very air itself, heavy with the stench of mildew and something darker, more ancient. Ethan shook his head. "We can't just sit here and do nothing. We have to find Mia. We have to," Clara interrupted, her voice rising in panic. "We've already done enough. We've already uncovered something that we shouldn't have, and now Mia is gone. If we stay, we're only making things worse." Jake, his face pale, stumbled toward the door. "Then let's leave. Let's get out of here now." But as he reached for the door, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deep inside the house. The windows rattled, and the air turned frigid. A low, guttural growl, like a rumble from the earth itself, shook the ground beneath them. Clara recoiled, instinctively stepping back. "It's too late," she whispered. "It's already here." The house shuddered again, and this time, the sound was unmistakable, a slow, deliberate dragging noise, like something heavy scraping against the floor. The walls shook as though the house were alive, moving, pulsating with an unholy energy. And then they heard it, a faint whisper, distant but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come." It was a voice, but not a human one. The sound crawled beneath their skin, resonating in their bones, as if the house itself were speaking to them. They turned in unison, eyes wide with terror, as the very walls of the cabin seemed to collapse inward, shifting and stretching, contorting in ways that defied all logic. "Get out!" Ethan yelled, but it was too late. The door slammed shut with such force that it rattled the foundation of the house. The room around them twisted, the floor buckling as though the very earth beneath them was being torn apart. "We're trapped," Clara whispered again, her voice thick with the realization that their fate was sealed. The shadows that had once been confined to the edges of the room began to move again. They stretched and grew, thickening like smoke, reaching toward them, enveloping them in a darkness that felt suffocating. It was as though the very space around them was being consumed by the shadows, the walls bleeding blackness, seeping into every crevice of the room. Jake backed away, his hands fumbling for the door handle that had once been their only hope. But it was no use. The door wouldn't budge. The shadows seemed to hum with a strange, electric energy, their edges pulsing in time with the house's sinister heartbeat. "What is this place?" Ethan asked, his voice raw with panic. "What the hell is happening?" "We've uncovered something we shouldn't have," Clara said, her words quiet but certain. "This house, this place, is not just haunted. It's alive, and it's not going to let us leave." As the shadows closed in, the floor beneath them groaned once more, a terrible, echoing sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. Something was coming, something old, something that had been waiting. And no matter how hard they tried to escape, it was clear now that the house had already decided their fate. The shadows were growing stronger, and they were no longer just specters. They were the walls, the floors, the very bones of the house itself, closing in on them with a hunger that couldn't be sated. And in the heart of the darkness, they could hear the whispers once more, growing louder, more insistent. "You cannot leave. You were never meant to." The darkness in the house was more than just an absence of light. It was a presence, a weight pressing down on them from every direction. As the walls closed in and the shadows seemed to stretch endlessly, there was a shift, a deeper chill that crept into their bones. Clara, Ethan, and Jake huddled together, their breath shallow, their minds reeling from the terror that was now part of the very air they breathed. For a moment, they did nothing but stand frozen in the center of the room, their eyes darting to the corners where the shadows swirled, never quite leaving them, as though something or someone was watching. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't the kind of silence that should have existed in a house full of people. It was a dead silence, an unnatural stillness that pressed in on them from all sides, muffling their senses, dampening their ability to think clearly. "Is it watching us?" Jake finally whispered, his voice tight with dread. Clara nodded, her eyes wide with the dawning realization. "Yes," she said softly. "It's been watching us from the beginning. From the moment we entered this place. It knew we would come." Ethan clenched his fists, his body tense, trying to suppress the panic that clawed at his throat. "This isn't just some haunted house. This place is alive. It's been waiting for us." He turned to Clara. "But why? Why us?" Clara could feel her thoughts spiraling, trying to piece together the fragmented clues that had slowly come to light since they entered. "I think this house is a trap, a prison. It pulls people in, feeds off their fear, their desperation. The longer we stay, the stronger it gets." Jake shook his head, eyes darting nervously to the darkened corners of the room. "So, what do we do? We can't just sit here and wait for it to kill us." Clara's gaze wandered around the room, scanning the oppressive shadows, the way they seemed to shift when no one was looking directly at them. "We need to leave, but it won't let us." Ethan frowned, his face hardening. "We have to find a way out. We have to fight back." Jake looked at him, fear evident in his eyes. "How? What can we possibly do? We can't even see it. It's not like we're dealing with a ghost here. This is something else, something more." As if on cue, the temperature in the room dropped again. The air became thick, and the shadows seemed to grow deeper, moving unnaturally, pulling at the edges of the room. The house groaned, and for a moment, they all thought they heard a low whisper, like a breath carried on the wind. It was hard to tell if it came from the walls or from inside their own heads. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice soft and insistent, reverberating through the room. The words sent a cold shiver through them all. Jake reached out, his hand trembling as he grabbed Clara's arm. "Did you hear that?" Clara nodded, her heart racing. "It's trying to communicate with us, but we can't understand it. Not fully. Whatever this thing is, it's ancient. It's been here for a long time, watching, waiting." The whisper came again, louder this time. "You're already lost. There is no escape." Ethan clenched his teeth, his muscles tight with fear. He reached for the door again, only to find that the handle had become slick with some kind of dark substance, like tar, and refused to turn. His mind raced for any other escape route, anything that would lead them out of this nightmare. But as he examined the room, a horrifying thought struck him. What if we're not meant to escape? What if this house is? Before he could finish his sentence, a violent crash echoed through the room. It was as though something had slammed against the walls from the inside, making the floor tremble beneath them. The lights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. And then, in the distance, there came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming closer. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and slow, as though whoever, or whatever, was moving through the house had all the time in the world. Each step reverberated through the air, carrying a sense of foreboding that only intensified as the noise grew louder. Clara's hand shot out to grasp Jake's arm, pulling him back from the door. "It's coming for us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible over the ominous sound. "I don't know," Clara admitted, her eyes darting around the room as though expecting something to materialize out of the shadows. "But whatever it is, it's not human. It's not like anything we've seen before." Ethan stood stiffly, staring into the darkened hallway, his heart pounding. The footsteps were closer now, but there was no sign of anyone. It was as though the very air had taken on a new texture, a thickness that made it difficult to breathe. The shadows were growing stronger, creeping closer to them with each passing moment, swallowing the light and plunging them further into the unknown. "We need to go. Now," Ethan said, his voice a rasp. But Clara was already shaking her head. "We can't. We're already trapped. The house is..." Before she could finish, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, as if the house itself were holding its breath. And then, with a suddenness that made them all jump, the door slammed open with a deafening bang. The room seemed to inhale, as though the house had just exhaled a long-held breath. But there was nothing on the other side, just emptiness. The three of them stood there, staring into the void, unsure of whether to step forward or retreat further into the house. They were caught between the fear of the unknown and the desperation to escape. But one thing was certain. The house was no longer just a structure of wood and stone. It had become something more, something sentient, something alive, and it was watching them, waiting. The house, in its sinister stillness, seemed to whisper louder now. The oppressive atmosphere clung to them like the damp, musty air of an abandoned tomb. Every footstep they took, every movement they made, seemed to echo, a reminder that they were never truly alone. Clara, Jake, and Ethan could feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing against them, as if something in the house knew them, knew their fears, their darkest thoughts, and reveled in it. After the door slammed open and offered them nothing but emptiness, the trio found themselves at a crossroads. The hallway ahead stretched out into the abyss, dimly lit by a flickering bulb above, casting erratic shadows across the walls. Yet, something about the way the shadows twisted unnerved them more than the darkness itself. They seemed to shift in response to their every movement, as though they were alive, paying attention. Clara, shaking her head in disbelief, muttered, "We need to keep moving. We can't stay here." Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the silence of the house, it felt too loud. She wanted to scream, to run, but something inside her, some primal instinct, kept her rooted in place, too terrified to move but too stubborn to give up. Ethan turned to Jake, his face hardening. "Do you think it's playing with us? That? Whatever it is?" There was an edge to his voice, the kind of frustration that came when the mind couldn't process what the eyes were seeing. "It knows where we are. It's been following us. But why? What does it want?" Jake's face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. "I don't know," he whispered. "But it feels like we're being tested, like it's trying to get us to break. But I won't." He broke off abruptly, his eyes darting to the end of the hallway. Clara followed his gaze, and her breath caught in her throat. At the far end of the hall stood an old, tarnished mirror framed in dark wood. It was out of place, too ornate for the decaying house, too pristine for the grime that clung to everything else. But it wasn't just the mirror that caught their attention. It was the reflection, or rather, the absence of it. In the glass, They saw not their own faces, but something darker. The reflection in the mirror was wrong, distorted. It showed a shadowy figure standing just behind them, a silhouette that wasn't there in reality. It wasn't the figure of any of them. It was something taller, something thinner, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Clara gasped and stepped back. "What is that? What is in the mirror?" She instinctively pulled Jake and Ethan away from it, but as she did, the reflection seemed to follow their movements, stretching and bending unnaturally. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was something real, something that had no place in this world. Ethan took a step forward, despite the terror clawing at his chest. It's not just a mirror. It's a portal, or something more. Something that's connected to whatever is in this house. His voice was barely audible, as if he were speaking against his own disbelief. As he approached the mirror, the air grew colder. He could feel the chill seeping into his skin, like icy fingers sliding up his spine. The shadowy figure in the reflection grew more pronounced, its outline sharper, as though it was drawing closer to the glass. A sense of dread gripped Ethan's heart. He wanted to look away, to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The mirror was pulling him in, drawing him into its depths, into the darkness that seemed to pulse and breathe. Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror moved. The figure tilted its head, as though it were studying them. It stretched its hand toward the glass, and as it did, the room around them seemed to warp. The edges of the walls distorted. The floor beneath their feet seemed to ripple, and the very air thickened with a suffocating presence. The figure in the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was reaching out, its hand passing through the glass with a sound like 1,000 whispers. Clara screamed and yanked Ethan back, pulling him away from the mirror. "Get away from it," she shouted, but it was too late. The figure's hand was already through the glass, its long, claw-like fingers curling toward them. Jake grabbed the nearest object, a rusted candlestick, and hurled it at the mirror, but as it struck, the mirror cracked. The sound echoed through the house like a death knell, and for a split second, everything went silent. But the silence was brief. The air grew even colder, and the house seemed to groan, as if it were alive and in pain. The shadows that had once seemed to only twist now began to ripple violently, as though the walls themselves were alive, pulsating with some unholy energy. Clara and Jake rushed to pull Ethan away, but as they did, the ground beneath them trembled. The walls began to shift, their forms warping, elongating. It was as if the very house was alive and angry. The mirror had opened something deeper than they could have ever imagined. The presence that had been watching them, that had been toying with them from the start, was no longer contained. It was free, and it was coming for them. But even as the house rumbled and groaned, there was another noise, soft, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have looked. Now you belong to me." Clara's blood ran cold. The house wasn't just trying to trap them. It had already marked them, and as the shadows closed in, it was clear there was no escape. After the horror of the mirror, the house seemed to shift into something even more dangerous, as though it were fully aware of their presence and intent on dragging them deeper into its nightmarish grip. The oppressive silence that had filled the air after the mirror cracked was short-lived, replaced now by a low hum, a sound like a distant heartbeat pulsing through the walls. It was as if the house itself was alive, its blood pumping through the rotting beams and cracked floors, waiting for its prey to be drawn closer. Clara, Jake, and Ethan found themselves in a state of stunned disbelief. The world around them had become something unfamiliar, an unsettling nightmare that seemed to bend the rules of reality. The shadows no longer followed the patterns they once did. They now seemed to writhe with purpose, creeping along the walls and ceilings like predatory creatures stalking their next meal. Each step they took only seemed to pull them deeper into the house's labyrinthine corridors, as if the walls were shifting and leading them into some unknown destination. "This can't be happening," Clara whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at Jake, as if he had the answer. He had always been the most grounded of them, the one with the logic to help explain things away. But now his face was pale, his eyes wide and distant. He was no longer the Jake she knew. He was just as lost as the rest of them. "I don't know what's going on," Jake replied, his words barely audible, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile barrier between them and whatever was lurking just out of sight. "I thought it was all in my head. But that mirror," he trailed off, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for any sign of safety. "It wasn't just a reflection. It was like it knew us. It knew we were here, that we were trespassing, that it had been waiting for us." Ethan, ever the skeptic, was the first to break the silence. "It's all connected," he said, his voice firm. "This house, the mirror, that thing we saw. I don't think it's just one thing. It's like it's all a part of something bigger. Something we're not supposed to understand." His words hung in the air like a truth too dangerous to face. For a moment, no one spoke. The implications of his statement were too terrifying to confront directly. If the house, the mirror, and whatever they had just encountered were all part of something bigger, then they were already trapped in its web. There was no escaping it. They were part of the house now, just as it had marked them when the mirror had cracked. The silence was broken by a soft, almost imperceptible scrape against the wall. They all froze. The noise came again, louder this time, followed by a series of tapping sounds that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within the house. It was as if something or someone was moving just beyond their reach, aware of their every move. The walls seemed to breathe with the noise, expanding and contracting like the chest of some monstrous creature. "We have to move," Clara said, her voice a mixture of fear and determination. "If we stay here, we're going to lose ourselves. We need to get out." But the fear in her voice betrayed her own doubts. She wasn't sure if they could leave anymore. Could they even find their way out? Ethan shook his head. "We've been here for hours, and we haven't found a single way out. We've circled back around every time. The house, it's changing. I don't think it'll let us leave. Whatever that mirror opened, it's part of the house now. And we're part of it." Clara's heart sank. He was right. They had already tried the windows, the doors, even the small attic they had discovered earlier. Each time they thought they had found a way out, they were led back into the same hallways, the same rooms, as if the house had closed in on itself. There was no way out. It was as if the house had become a living organism, a thing that swallowed its visitors whole, one by one. Jake clenched his fists, the tension radiating from him like heat. "So, what do we do? Wait here to die? Hope it gets bored of us?" He was nearly shouting now, his frustration turning into panic. Clara could feel the walls closing in around them. It was becoming harder to breathe. The air had thickened, the shadows had deepened, and the house seemed to pulse with an almost palpable malevolence. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside, felt like a prelude to something far worse. The house was toying with them, drawing them closer to some unspeakable fate. "We need to find out what this place really is," Ethan said, his voice suddenly steady. "There's something here, something we're not seeing, something that controls this whole thing. And I think if we figure out what that is, we might be able to stop it." Clara felt a surge of hope, despite everything. If Ethan was right, if they could uncover whatever dark secret the house held, they might stand a chance of escaping. But the deeper they ventured into the house, the more she realized how little they truly understood. The house wasn't just a building. It was an entity. It was alive, and it had been waiting for them. They were no longer mere intruders. They had been chosen. As they walked deeper into the house, the walls seemed to close in even further. The shadows grew thicker, darker. The tapping and scraping sounds intensified, now coming from all directions, as though the very house was alive and watching them. The temperature dropped with each step, the chill creeping into their bones. Clara turned to Jake and Ethan. They were pale, their faces drawn with fear, but there was something else in their eyes too, something like resignation. They knew, as she did, that the house had them now. It wasn't just a matter of finding an exit. It was about survival. And in this place, survival wasn't guaranteed. The house had claimed them, and there was no turning back. The house had become something else entirely. It no longer felt like the decaying, abandoned structure they had stumbled into, but rather like a living, breathing entity that had claimed them as part of its own twisted design. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the shadows deepening and expanding as though they were aware of every move the trio made. Clara, Jake, and Ethan had hoped that understanding the house's mysteries might lead to an escape, but each step they took seemed to draw them deeper into its inescapable grasp. As they ventured further into the heart of the house, the atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive. It was as though the very air itself had thickened, making it harder to breathe with each passing second. The creaking of the floorboards beneath their feet became more pronounced, echoing in the silence like the warning of a predator closing in. The once faint tapping noises, which they had dismissed as the house settling, had grown into a cacophony, scraping, knocking, thumping, as if the house was responding to their every thought. Jake had stopped speaking altogether, his face pale, his lips pressed into a thin line, as though even the act of talking might provoke the house into more aggressive action. Ethan, too, had fallen silent, his mind racing, trying to piece together the ever-increasing puzzle that seemed to shift with every room they entered. But Clara couldn't stop thinking. The house was full of secrets that seemed to have been buried deep within its walls for generations, waiting for the right moment to resurface. It wasn't long before they came across something new, something unexpected. A narrow hallway led to a door that appeared slightly ajar. The wood of the door was old and weathered, but there was something about the way it beckoned that made Clara's heart race. She was reluctant to approach, yet some force, whether curiosity or sheer desperation, compelled her forward. Ethan and Jake followed in silence, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the house as they moved closer to the door. The moment Clara stepped inside, she knew it was different from any other room they had explored. The air felt dense, heavy with an unspoken history, as though the very walls were alive with memories too painful to recall. The room was furnished sparsely, but there was a large, ornate mirror on the far wall. It was cracked, much like the one they had encountered before, but this one felt different, more deliberate, more ominous. As Clara stepped closer, the mirror seemed to pull her in, its surface rippling as though it were made of water rather than glass. She hesitated, her fingers mere inches from the surface, when she felt a coldness radiate from it. A whisper, soft and barely audible, brushed against her ear, too faint to understand, but enough to make her heart skip a beat. She pulled her hand back, but the mirror seemed to beckon her still, its surface distorting into strange, unrecognizable shapes. "Clara," Jake's voice cut through the tension, shaky but insistent. "We need to get out of here." But even as he spoke, Clara felt a compulsion to touch the mirror, to understand what it was trying to show her. There was something about it, something hidden within its depths that called to her. A memory, a secret, a truth waiting to be unearthed. She reached out again, her fingers brushing the surface. The moment her skin made contact, the mirror's reflection seemed to shift. Her own image wavered, replaced by something else, a figure, tall and shadowed, standing just behind her. Clara's breath caught in her throat, and she whirled around, but there was nothing there. "Clara, stop!" Ethan's voice was louder now, tinged with panic. "This place, this house, it's not right. It's alive." His words were punctuated by a loud crack, like the sound of wood splintering. The floor beneath them groaned as though it was shifting, preparing to swallow them whole. Clara felt a tremor run through her as she turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, but it had changed. Its face was obscured, as though it were hidden behind a veil of shadows. It began to move, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, its body distorting and writhing as if made of liquid. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of voices, too many to count, all speaking in an ancient language she couldn't understand. "What is that thing?" Jake breathed, his voice cracking with fear. "I don't know," Clara whispered, but deep down, she felt a chilling sense of familiarity. She knew this figure. She couldn't explain how, but she did. It was connected to her, to all of them. Suddenly, the figure in the mirror spoke, its voice a low, guttural murmur that reverberated in Clara's bones. "You are mine now." The words seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with an ancient power that made Clara's heart stop. The ground beneath them shook violently, and the lights overhead flickered before plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through Clara as the house seemed to tighten its grip. "We need to get out now," she shouted, but it was too late. The mirror's reflection began to distort once more, and Clara could feel herself being drawn into it. Her body pulled forward against her will. Her vision blurred as the room around her spun, the edges of reality unraveling, and everything she knew began to disintegrate. In those final moments before everything went black, Clara realized the horrifying truth. The house wasn't just a place. It was a trap. It had been waiting for them all along, and now they were part of it, their fate sealed by the very mirror that had opened the doorway to their doom. The house was alive, and it had claimed them. The darkness in the house seemed to press against Clara's eyelids, as if trying to suffocate her very thoughts. She felt herself sinking, trapped in a void where time and space no longer existed. The air was thick, heavy with a sense of foreboding that she could neither escape nor understand. The weight of the mirror's words hung in the air, echoing through her mind. "You are mine now." They were not just words. They were a decree, a curse, an undeniable truth. She could feel the pull of that reality, its icy tendrils wrapping around her heart, making it difficult to breathe, to think, to move. Clara's mind raced as the cold darkness closed in. She remembered the figure, its shadowy form, the way it seemed to know her. The mirror had shown something that went beyond the realm of human understanding. She could not explain it, nor could she deny it. That figure in the mirror was not just a reflection. It was part of the house, part of its sinister power, and it was connected to them in a way that was far deeper than they could comprehend. When Clara finally regained consciousness, the world around her was no longer familiar. She was no longer in the hallway, nor in the room with the mirror. She was lying on the floor of what seemed to be a new, unfamiliar space, a room of stone, its walls cold and unyielding. The smell of earth and decay filled her nostrils. There was no light, only the faintest glimmer of something far beyond her reach, some distant source of illumination that cast fleeting shadows against the walls. She sat up with difficulty, the movement making her head spin. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to the ground, trying to steady herself. Slowly, she realized she wasn't alone. Jake and Ethan were sprawled across the floor as well, though neither of them seemed to be conscious. The faint glow in the room seemed to illuminate them with an eerie, unnatural light. Clara shook Jake's shoulder, and then Ethan's, trying to wake them, but neither stirred. Fear gripped her chest as she tried to make sense of what was happening. How had they ended up here? How had the house changed so drastically in the span of mere moments? The events of the last few hours felt like a dream, a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from, and yet the palpable fear she felt was as real as the cold stone beneath her hands. But it was a sound that broke through her confusion, a soft, melodic humming, distant but growing nearer. The tone was soothing at first, almost hypnotic, but something about it was wrong. The song was not a tune that a human could sing. It was too perfect, too eerie, as though it were coming from something ancient, something that had never known the human voice. The sound filled the room, vibrating through the stones, and Clara's blood ran cold. She stood up shakily, her body unsteady as she tried to locate the source of the sound. The walls of the stone room seemed to close in around her, the floor beneath her feet shifting slightly as if the room itself were alive. Her pulse quickened as she heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and accompanied by a soft scraping like metal on stone. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision, just out of reach of the faint light, but Clara couldn't tell what it was. "Jake? Ethan?" Clara's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper in the overwhelming silence. Neither of them responded, their bodies unmoving on the floor as if they were trapped in some kind of stupor. The humming grew louder, more insistent, pulling at her from all sides. And then, From the shadows, a figure appeared. At first, Clara thought it was another hallucination, some distortion of her mind brought on by the house's twisted influence. But as the figure stepped into the dim light, it became clear that this was not a figment of her imagination. It was tall, its body draped in a cloak made of what appeared to be tattered, rotting fabric. Its face was obscured by a dark veil, but Clara could feel its gaze on her. The figure moved with an unnatural grace, its steps silent despite its size. The humming seemed to emanate from it, or perhaps from the very air around it, weaving its way into Clara's consciousness, threatening to drown her in its melody. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and spindly, the skin pale and stretched tightly over its bones. Clara stepped back instinctively, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. She was paralyzed by fear, by a deep, insurmountable terror that rooted her to the spot. The figure's hand hovered just inches from her face, its fingers twitching as though it were savoring the moment. It spoke, its voice a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to resonate within her skull. "You wanted knowledge," it rasped, the words dripping with malice. "Now you shall learn what you were never meant to know." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to fight, to resist whatever power this entity wielded. But her mind was clouded with confusion and dread. She had sought the truth about the house, about its secrets, but this was not the knowledge she had expected. This was something darker, more dangerous than anything she could have imagined. The figure's grip tightened, and Clara's mind was flooded with images, visions of the house's past, its history stretching back centuries. She saw figures moving through the rooms, their faces twisted in anguish, their forms disfigured by some horrific event. She saw sacrifices made in the name of some incomprehensible force, the house itself being built as a prison for something far more ancient than any of them could understand. The knowledge that Clara had sought had come at a steep price. Her mind was unraveling under the weight of what she had uncovered. The truth was a burden too heavy to bear. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the vision stopped. The figure withdrew its hand, and the room fell into an oppressive silence. Clara's legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The room seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as though it were aware of her understanding, her acceptance of what it had shown her. The entity's presence loomed over her like a storm cloud, darkening everything in its wake. In the distance, she heard a door creak open. It was faint, but the sound seemed to break the silence like the crack of a whip. Someone was coming, but Clara knew, deep in her soul, that whatever she had uncovered had only just begun. The house had many more secrets to reveal, and now they were all part of it. Clara could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, its influence suffocating her every thought. The revelation of its dark history, of the horrors that had been wrought within its walls, left her with a sense of both dread and inevitability. There was no turning back. She had crossed a line, not just between the known and the unknown, but between the living and the dead. The entity, the figure cloaked in decay and silence, had marked her with a knowledge too terrible to comprehend, but now that she had it, there was no escaping its grasp. The shadows seemed to grow longer with every passing moment, as if they were waiting for her next move. In the aftermath of the figure's departure, Clara found herself alone with her thoughts, her mind swirling with images she could hardly process. The past she had witnessed, the tortured souls, the sacrifices, the endless cycle of torment, seemed to echo in the very bones of the house. The walls, the floors, the air itself felt alive, pulsing with an ancient energy that she could no longer deny. It was as if the house itself had been waiting for her, for all of them, to uncover its secrets. And now that they had, there would be no escape. Her thoughts turned to Jake and Ethan, still unconscious on the cold stone floor. They had seen the same thing she had, heard the same voice, felt the same pressure. And yet, they had not awakened. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to rouse them. She shook Jake, his body limp and unresponsive, before moving to Ethan, repeating the same desperate motions. But no matter how much she tried, neither of them stirred. The silence of the room weighed heavily on her, each passing second growing longer, more oppressive. It was as though the house had already claimed them. Clara's mind raced, wondering what the figure had meant when it had spoken. You wanted knowledge. Now you shall learn what you were never meant to know. She had assumed that the knowledge was simply the truth of the house, the dark and twisted history it had hidden for so long. But now, she wasn't so sure. Was there more to this knowledge than she had already seen? Was the entity's warning a precursor to something worse? Something yet to come? As her thoughts spiraled, Clara became aware of a faint sound, a distant creaking, followed by the soft murmur of whispers. At first, she dismissed it as a trick of the mind, a product of the fear and exhaustion that had consumed her. But the whispers persisted, growing louder and more distinct with each passing moment. They were not just echoes of the past. They were voices real and alive, speaking in a language that Clara couldn't understand. They seemed to come from every corner of the room, swirling around her like a storm. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and Clara shivered as an unnatural chill seeped into her bones. The whispers seemed to take on a new tone, more insistent, more urgent. There was a sense of desperation in them, as though they were trying to warn her of something she couldn't see, couldn't understand. But the more she tried to focus, the more the words eluded her, slipping through her mind like water through her fingers. It was then that she noticed the door at the far end of the room. It was ajar just slightly, as if something had passed through it recently. Clara's instinct screamed at her to stay put, to remain where it was safe. But the whispers, the unnerving sensation of being watched, urged her forward. She couldn't ignore them. Not now. Not after everything she had learned. She had to know more. She had to understand what was happening. Taking a deep breath, Clara slowly moved toward the door, her footsteps hesitant at first, then more resolute as she drew closer. The door creaked as it opened further, revealing a narrow hallway beyond. The whispers were louder now, their source somewhere in the darkness ahead. There was no turning back. She could feel the weight of the house bearing down on her, its presence palpable, as if it were drawing her in, beckoning her deeper into its labyrinthine halls. The hallway was long, stretching farther than Clara could see, but she knew that whatever awaited her at the end of it was not going to be comforting. The house had already shown its true nature, and it was clear that it held more secrets, more horrors, than she could possibly comprehend. Every step she took seemed to echo through the hall, amplifying the sense of isolation and fear that clung to her like a second skin. The whispers, too, seemed to grow louder the farther she went, their meaning still unclear, but their tone unmistakably filled with dread. At the end of the hallway, Clara found a door, a wooden, intricately carved door that stood out against the otherwise plain walls. It was old, its edges worn and weathered by time, but it was the symbols etched into its surface that caught her attention. They were unlike any symbol she had seen before, strange and alien, as if they belonged to another world, another time. The air around the door hummed with energy, and Clara could feel the static charge building into space between her and the threshold. As she reached for the handle, the whispers reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices crying out in unison. Clara's heart skipped a beat, her hand trembling as she gripped the door. The sense of anticipation in the air was suffocating, and she knew that whatever lay beyond this door would change everything. It was the final step in a journey she had never intended to take, one that had dragged her into the depths of a nightmare she could neither understand nor escape. With a trembling breath, Clara pushed open the door, and as it creaked open, the darkness beyond seemed to engulf her whole. The whispers stopped, the house fell silent, and Clara stepped into the unknown. The door closed behind Clara with a soft thud, sealing her in a world that felt both alien and familiar. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, a silence so absolute it seemed to press in on her from all sides. The room she had entered was unlike any other she had seen in the house. It was neither ornate nor bare, but filled with a strange, unsettling atmosphere. The walls, made of a dark, glossy stone, reflected no light, as though the very substance of the room absorbed it. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she stepped forward, her heart racing, her senses heightened by the disorienting silence that surrounded her. At first glance, the room seemed empty, void of furniture, of any sign of life. But Clara's instincts told her otherwise. There was something here, something beyond the tangible, something waiting in the shadows. The air itself seemed to shimmer with an energy that was not quite visible, but undeniably present, like a faint hum that vibrated at the edges of perception. The floor beneath her feet was cold, smooth, and featureless, as though it were made from a material not meant for human touch. Clara's steps felt muffled, swallowed by the vastness of the room, and yet every sound she made seemed to echo, reverberating off the walls in a strange, unnatural cadence. A sudden shift in the atmosphere made Clara pause. The silence, once oppressive, now felt heavy, as though something unseen had moved within the room, something that was aware of her presence. Her eyes darted to every corner, every crack in the walls, but there was nothing except shadows that seemed to twist unnaturally, as though they were alive, breathing in sync with her own anxious pulse. It was as though the very fabric of reality had been altered, warped by forces beyond human comprehension. Clara's gaze shifted toward the far end of the room. There, in the center of the far wall, was an archway, an opening, though it lacked a door, an entrance into something deeper, darker. It was a portal, but it was not a portal in the traditional sense. The edges of the arch seemed to ripple, as though it were a tear in the very fabric of space. The air surrounding it shimmered, distorting Clara's vision, making her question whether it was real at all. She felt drawn to it, an inexplicable compulsion to move closer, as if the archway were calling her, beckoning her to step through and discover what lay beyond. Her feet carried her forward before she could stop herself, and as she approached the arch, a strange sound, like a soft, distant whisper, reached her ears. It was almost imperceptible at first, but as she drew nearer, the voices became clearer, their tone more urgent. They weren't the same whispers she had heard earlier, though. These were different, more deliberate, more calculated. They spoke in a language she could not understand, a guttural, ancient tongue that seemed to scrape against her very soul. The words felt invasive, like fingers reaching into her mind, trying to pull out something buried deep within her. Clara stopped just short of the archway, her hand hovering in the air as though she were afraid to touch it. The voices were louder now, but they weren't just speaking. They were pressing against her thoughts, urging her to step forward. The pull of the arch was undeniable, and for a moment, Clara almost felt as though she were no longer in control of her own body. Her mind screamed for her to turn around, to flee, but her legs refused to obey. The strange sensation that had overtaken her earlier, the one that made her feel like the house was alive, watching her, was stronger now, more pronounced. Before she could take another step, something shifted within the archway. The air before her began to ripple, the distortion deepening, and Clara saw a flicker of light, something white, something blinding, flash from within. She recoiled instinctively, a sense of warning flooding her senses. But before she could retreat, the light vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only a void in its wake. And then, in the silence that followed, Clara heard a voice. A real voice, low, familiar, yet somehow distorted, as though it were coming from a place far removed from this world. "Clara," it whispered, the sound both comforting and terrifying at once. "Come closer." The voice sent a shock through her, and for a moment, Clara wasn't sure if she had imagined it. But the pull of the archway remained, undeniable, stronger than ever. It was not just a lure, it was a command, an irresistible force that seemed to drag at the very core of her being. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, inching closer to the portal. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, to run, to turn away from whatever was waiting on the other side. But her body betrayed her, her hand moving steadily toward the shimmering edges of the arch. As her fingers brushed against the distorted air, the room around her seemed to warp. The walls, the floor, the very space itself seemed to dissolve, stretching and bending into impossible shapes. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, demanding her attention, their words overlapping and blending together in a maddening swirl. Clara's heart raced as she felt herself pulled deeper into the distortion, her mind growing dizzy with the overwhelming sensation of being torn between two worlds. Then, in an instant, everything stopped. The whispers fell silent. The room stilled. Clara was no longer standing in the same place. She wasn't even sure she was in the same world. The air was different here, thicker, heavier. The silence was complete, suffocating. She could feel it pressing down on her, as though the very atmosphere was trying to crush her. Her eyes strained in the dim light, trying to make sense of the space she now found herself in. The archway was gone, and the room that had once been a portal was now an endless expanse of darkness. And then, from the depths of the void, a figure emerged. It was not human, not entirely, but it was something familiar, something that Clara had seen before. It was the figure from her dreams, from the vision she had experienced earlier in the house. It had followed her, had waited for this moment. Its eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, Clara understood. This was not just a haunted house. This was the entrance to a realm beyond, a place where the past, the present, and the future all collided. And Clara was trapped in it. Clara had barely registered the figure before her when the world around her began to dissolve once again. This time, however, there was no confusion, no disorientation. She could feel the change, the shift in the atmosphere, as though she were being pulled back from a deep abyss. The figure, the one that had emerged from the depths of the void, faded slowly, dissolving like smoke in the air, leaving Clara standing alone in the overwhelming darkness. The silence, once deafening, now felt almost suffocating, as though the space itself were holding its breath. There was nothing around her but the vast emptiness of an unending void. For a moment, Clara stood frozen, her mind struggling to comprehend what she had just experienced. She had stepped into something she couldn't understand, into a place beyond reason or explanation. Her heart was racing, and every instinct screamed for her to run, to escape this realm that seemed to defy all logic. But there was nowhere to run. The very space seemed to mock her, stretching into infinity in every direction. It was as if she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return, no safe harbor to seek refuge. The reality she had known, the world of light, sound, and color, felt far away, like a distant dream that was slipping from her grasp. And then, a faint light began to appear in the distance. At first, it was nothing more than a tiny pinprick, a distant glimmer in the overwhelming darkness. But it grew larger, more pronounced, until Clara could make out its shape, a reflection, a mirror, standing alone in the center of the void. The mirror was unlike any she had seen before. Its frame was made of twisted, gnarled metal, as if it had been forged from the very fabric of the void itself. The glass was opaque, its surface cloudy and murky, as though it were concealing something deep within. Clara couldn't help but feel drawn to it. She had seen mirrors before, countless times, in the house she had come to know so well. But this one felt different. It was not simply a reflective surface. It was an invitation, a challenge. And yet, it also felt like a trap, a lure that promised to show her something she was not ready to see. She knew, deep down, that looking into it would change everything. But she was past the point of hesitation. The pull of the mirror was irresistible, and her feet began to carry her toward it before she could stop herself. As Clara approached, the air around her began to hum, vibrating with a low, almost imperceptible frequency. The humming grew louder as she neared the mirror, filling her ears with a strange pressure. It was as though the very sound of the void was resonating in her bones, rattling her from the inside out. Her breath quickened, but she couldn't stop herself. She reached out with trembling fingers and touched the cool, smooth surface of the mirror. The moment her fingers made contact, the glass rippled, distorting the image before her. For a brief, terrifying instant, Clara saw not her own reflection, but something else. It was a dark, distorted version of herself, her face twisted in an expression of pure terror. Her eyes were wide with fear, her mouth open in a silent scream. It was as if the reflection in the mirror was showing her a version of herself, trapped in some unspeakable nightmare. Clara recoiled, pulling her hand away from the mirror, but the image lingered, burned into her mind. The reflection remained, frozen in place, as if mocking her fear. But then the image changed. The distorted face faded, replaced by something even more unsettling. Clara's own face reappeared, but this time, it was no longer just a reflection. The face in the mirror began to move independently of her own, its lips curling into a grin that stretched unnaturally wide. The smile was not hers. It was a grotesque parody of happiness, a twisted expression that seemed to mock the very essence of her being. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the mirror, horrified by what she was seeing. The reflection began to speak, its voice a low, mocking tone that sent chills down Clara's spine. "You think you're in control," it said, its voice dripping with disdain. "You think you know what's happening here. But you don't. You never did." The words were not just spoken. They were embedded in Clara's mind, reverberating through her thoughts like an insistent drumbeat. Clara stepped back, her mind reeling from the reflection's words. She didn't understand. What was happening? How could the mirror know what she was thinking? She had come here seeking answers, but the more she tried to make sense of the situation, the more impossible it seemed. It was as though the mirror was showing her not just her face, but a deeper truth, one she wasn't ready to confront. The reflection in the mirror had become something else entirely, a manifestation of her fear, her guilt, her doubts. It was as though it was peeling back the layers of her soul, exposing everything she had hidden away. And then, the voice spoke again, this time more insistent. "You've been running, Clara. Running from the truth. Running from what you've always known deep down. You can't escape it. You never could." Clara felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. The words hit her like a physical blow, each one a dagger aimed at her heart. She knew, somehow, that the mirror was right. There was something she had been avoiding, something she had been too afraid to face. But what was it? What truth was the mirror trying to show her? The reflection in the glass seemed to leer at her, its grin widening even further, as though it knew she was on the verge of understanding. Clara's legs shook as she struggled to keep her composure, but the weight of the revelation was almost too much to bear. She had thought she was simply trapped in a haunted house, a place of dark secrets and twisted horrors. But now, she realized this was more than just a house. This was a prison built from her own fears, her own choices. And the truth, whatever it was locked away within her. The mirror seemed to pulse, its surface rippling as though alive, and Clara's vision blurred. She felt herself drawn forward, pulled by the force of the reflection's power, but she fought against it, summoning the strength to turn away. She couldn't look anymore, not at this version of herself, not at the twisted truth that the mirror was trying to reveal. With a final, desperate breath, Clara broke free from the trance, stumbling backward. The mirror's reflection faded, leaving her standing in the silent void once more. But she knew, deep down, that the truth had been revealed. She wasn't just trapped in the house. She was trapped within herself. And there was no escaping that. Clara stood frozen, still trembling from the reflection that had not only unsettled her, but also unraveled a truth too painful to confront. The mirror's mockery lingered in her mind like a dark stain, each word echoing with an insidious resonance. "You've been running," it had said, as though it knew exactly how deeply her fears had festered, how long she had concealed them beneath layers of distraction and denial. The house she had entered, once a place of curious intrigue, now felt like a labyrinth of her own making, one whose walls closed in with every passing second. As Clara took a hesitant step back, she felt the darkness pressing closer, as if the very void that surrounded her was responding to her fear. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, as though the atmosphere itself had become saturated with the knowledge of her guilt. The house, the place that had lured her in with its eerie charm, was no longer a mere building. It had become an extension of herself, a reflection of her fractured psyche. She could no longer deny it. She had wandered into a realm far deeper than anything she had anticipated. It wasn't just a haunted house. It was a mirror of her inner turmoil. With each breath, the void seemed to grow more oppressive, suffocating her with its silence. She was no longer in control of her surroundings. The idea that she had entered this place in search of answers now seemed naive, almost foolish. The truth had been there all along, hidden not in the shadows of the house, but in the recesses of her own heart. The mirror had shown her a reflection she couldn't ignore, a version of herself that was so twisted by regret, by unacknowledged fears, that it had taken shape in the very fabric of the space around her. And the more she tried to escape it, the more it consumed her. The ground beneath her feet began to shift, pulling her attention back to the present. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Clara realized that she was not alone. The silence that had enveloped her was being replaced by a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a low, echoing hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was not a sound one could simply hear. It was a vibration, something deeper than the physical senses. Clara could feel it in the marrow of her bones, a sensation that threatened to distort her perception of reality itself. With a sense of rising dread, she turned toward the source of the hum. The walls, which had previously been smooth and dark, now seemed to shimmer, distorting before her eyes. The air thickened with a palpable presence, as though the house itself had come alive, reacting to her fear, feeding off her unease. The hum grew louder, more insistent, until it reached a pitch that made her ears ache. Clara stumbled backward, clutching her head, trying to block out the sound that was now reverberating through her skull. It was as though the house were speaking to her, whispering its terrible secrets in a language she could barely understand. Her vision blurred once again, and she felt a familiar pull, a magnetic force drawing her deeper into the house's heart. The walls seemed to stretch and shift around her, changing shape as though they were responding to her every movement. It was as if the very architecture was designed to trap her, to keep her from escaping the nightmare that had become her reality. Clara tried to resist, but her feet moved on their own, carried forward by an unseen hand. She was no longer in control. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed others before her. Her body ached with the effort to break free, but the pull grew stronger with each passing moment. The deeper she ventured, the more the house seemed to warp and contort, as if the structure itself were alive, feeding on her fear. The walls, once solid and unyielding, now seemed to pulse and breathe with a life of their own. Clara's heart raced as she realized she was no longer moving through a house. She was moving through a living, breathing entity, one that had been designed to consume her. In the distance, she saw a flicker of light, a glimmer of hope in the otherwise oppressive darkness. Without thinking, she moved toward it, drawn by the possibility of escape, of finding a way out of this nightmare. But as she neared, the light revealed itself to be nothing more than an illusion. It was a doorway, if you could even call it that, a narrow slit in the wall that seemed to stretch impossibly long. The light that emanated from it was harsh, sterile, like the glow of a hospital room rather than a comforting beacon of safety. And as she reached the threshold, Clara realized the truth. The doorway wasn't an escape. It was a trap. Her reflection, her twisted, mocking reflection, stared back at her from within the doorway, but it wasn't just her face anymore. It was a twisted amalgamation of all her regrets, her fears, her failures, all reflected in the murky, distorted glass. The door was no longer a means of salvation. It was a mirror, a reflection of the chaos she had built in her own mind. It was her mind that had shaped this house, not the other way around. This was no haunted building, no external force playing with her sanity. It was her, and her alone. The weight of that realization struck Clara like a physical blow. She collapsed to her knees, unable to breathe, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what she had just understood. The house had never been alive. It had never been haunted by any external force. It was the manifestation of her own mind, a dark reflection of everything she had tried to suppress, to avoid, to run from. The truth was that she had always been the one pulling the strings. She had built this house from the fragments of her own soul, and now she was trapped within it. There was no escaping it. There never had been. As the hum continued to vibrate through the air, Clara's mind began to unravel. She had thought the mirror held the key, that it could unlock the mystery of her past, her fears. But it had only revealed the cruel truth, that there was no mystery, no dark force to fight against. There was only her, and she was the one who had condemned herself to this nightmare. There was no escape from the weight of the abyss she had created. The house would never let her go, not because it was alive, but because it was a part of her. And there was no running from that. Clara's body trembled with the weight of the revelation. The door that had seemed like a way out was now just another reflection of her entrapment. She had been trying to escape something that had never existed outside of her own mind. And now, with nowhere left to turn, Clara realized the terrifying truth. The house had already won. The only way out was through it. Clara's mind struggled to grasp the enormity of her realization. For a moment, it felt as though the world itself had shifted beneath her, as though the ground had opened up to swallow her whole. The house that had once seemed like a labyrinth of mysteries, a series of corridors and rooms to be explored, now felt like a cage. Every step she took within it only seemed to tighten the grip around her, and with each corner she turned, the walls seemed to shift and warp, as if mocking her attempts to escape. The door, once an illusion of safety, now stood as an insurmountable barrier. Clara could no longer look at it as a possible exit. Instead, it became the embodiment of her failure, a reflection of the part of herself she could never escape. She had thought that by entering this house, she might unravel the truth of her past, confront the hidden fears that had haunted her for years. But in doing so, she had only uncovered the truth that she had been running from herself all along. Her body trembled as the weight of that knowledge began to settle in. It wasn't the house that was haunted, but her own consciousness. Every room, every corridor, every mirror within it reflected a part of her, an aspect of herself she had long ago buried. The house was no longer an external force. It was a physical manifestation of her fractured psyche, a space created from the dark corners of her soul. The strange hum that had filled the air was no longer a distant sound. It was a part of her, vibrating in the very core of her being. In the quiet that followed, Clara tried to gather her thoughts, to make sense of the overwhelming flood of realization. She had spent her entire life trying to outrun her mistakes, her regrets, and the darkness she carried within her. She had convinced herself that the key to her salvation lay outside of herself. Perhaps in the house, perhaps in some external force that could explain the chaos of her life. But the truth was far simpler and far more terrifying. She had always been the one responsible for the storm inside her. The house, the mirrors, the voices, they were all her doing, and there was no escape from the truth of her own creation. As the realization sank deeper, Clara felt a sense of paralysis grip her. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. The weight of her own self-awareness was suffocating, like a heavy stone pressing against her chest. There had been no force in the house that could harm her except the one she had allowed to fester within. She had built the house as a place to hide from the horrors of her own mind, but now that sanctuary had become a prison. Each step she had taken had led her deeper into the labyrinth of her own making. She had spent so long blaming external circumstances for her pain, the death of loved ones, the mistakes of her past, the things that had been done to her. But in the quiet of the house, with only her own reflection staring back at her, Clara could no longer deny the truth. She was the one who had created her own suffering. She had chosen to hide from the parts of herself she hated, and in doing so, she had built walls that now trapped her. The house was not the cause of her misery. It was the product of her refusal to confront it. As the silence stretched on, Clara began to walk, though each step felt heavier than the last. She moved through the house mechanically, as though on autopilot, her thoughts swirling around her like a storm. She had no destination in mind, no place to go. There was no longer any safe room, no comforting space where she could shut out the truth. The house had no doors she could escape through, not because it was physically locked, but because the doors had never existed outside of her mind. Each room, each passageway, was an extension of her own mind, and there was no place to run from herself. Her eyes scanned the dark, shifting walls as she moved through the house. Every surface seemed to shift with her, mirroring her thoughts and emotions. The cracks in the walls widened, as though they too were trying to consume her, to pull her deeper into the abyss. The mirror she had once found so fascinating now loomed ominously, reflecting back the fractured pieces of her identity that she had tried so desperately to avoid. There was no way to reconcile the shattered parts of herself that the house had forced her to face. Each reflection she encountered revealed a version of Clara she couldn't bear to see, an image of herself as a victim, as a perpetrator of her own suffering. In a sudden, visceral moment, Clara's body collapsed to the floor, her hands clutching at her chest as though trying to push the weight of her own self-awareness out of her. She gasped for air, as though the very act of breathing had become an insurmountable task. The house seemed to pulse around her, vibrating with the hum that had now become an ever-present companion. Clara realized that it wasn't just the house that had been affected by her. She had become a part of it, an entity woven into its very fabric. But the realization didn't bring clarity. It only made things worse. The more she tried to understand, to find a way to undo the mess she had created, the more the house seemed to shift, to twist itself into even more complicated shapes. The truth was slipping through her fingers like sand. The harder she grasped, the more it eluded her. In every direction she looked, she saw only the same thing: herself broken and fragmented. For a brief moment, Clara thought she heard a voice, faint, distant, but undeniably clear. It wasn't the hum she had become so accustomed to. It was her own voice calling her name, calling for help. But Clara knew that it wasn't a plea for salvation. It was a reflection of her own desperation, a cry for release from the house that had become her mind's prison. There was no answer to her cries. There never would be. The house had claimed her, and she had, in turn, claimed it. The walls that had once seemed like barriers to the outside world were now the walls that held her in place. The mirrors that reflected her deepest fears were the mirrors she could never escape. And as Clara sat there, surrounded by the pulsating walls of her own creation, she understood one thing with absolute certainty: she would never leave. Not because the house would not let her go, but because she had never intended to leave it in the first place. The house was her, and she was the house. Clara sat, still, amidst the disorienting hum of the house. The air felt thick with tension, as though the very walls were breathing with her. Each exhale she made seemed to deepen the void around her, amplifying the sense of suffocation that had settled into her chest. The knowledge that she had been running from herself for so long had paralyzed her, leaving her unable to move or think clearly. Yet in this silence, in the stifling atmosphere of her own creation, a realization began to form. A realization that, perhaps, she was not as powerless as she had believed. For years, Clara had seen herself as a victim of forces beyond her control, swept along by circumstances, by the shadows of her past, by people who had wronged her. She had lived her life in reaction, making choices based on what she feared or regretted, always seeking to escape the things that frightened her the most. But now, locked within this house that seemed to embody her deepest fears and desires, she saw something else entirely: the role she had played in shaping her own life. The house, with its twisting corridors and elusive mirrors, was not just a reflection of her mind. It was the physical manifestation of every choice she had made, every decision that had led her down this path. Each room, each hallway, was an echo of a moment in time, a choice she had made in the past, and the house had grown as she had grown. It had adapted to her fears, her desires, and her denials. The more she had resisted acknowledging the darker parts of herself, the more the house had expanded, turning into a labyrinth from which there was no escape. For the first time, Clara understood that the house wasn't an external force imposing itself upon her. It was the result of her own internal landscape, shaped by her decisions. Every door she had opened, every path she had chosen, had led her deeper into this space. The house was not just a prison. It was a record of her journey, a map of every fork in the road where she had hesitated or turned away. Each wrong turn, each avoidance, had led her here, to this moment where the walls themselves seemed to close in on her. As Clara rose from the floor, the sense of suffocation began to shift into something else, an uncomfortable awareness of the possibility that lay before her. If the house was a reflection of her choices, then perhaps it could be undone by the very same means. She could choose differently. She could choose to confront the darkness she had buried for so long. This was not a place of hopelessness. It was a place of opportunity, of potential change. But that awareness, in its stark clarity, was also terrifying. To confront her own choices meant acknowledging the consequences of her actions. And for Clara, that was not a simple task. The walls of the house seemed to whisper, as if mocking her newfound realization. They had been built over years of avoidance, over years of ignoring the quiet voice that had urged her to face the truth. The mirrors, once cruel reflections of her insecurities, now felt like windows into her past. She could see the fragments of herself she had tried so desperately to bury. Moments of weakness, moments of shame, moments of regret. They were there, staring back at her with unrelenting clarity. But there was something else too. Between those moments of darkness, there were glimpses of strength, of resilience, of times when Clara had chosen to rise above the circumstances that sought to define her. The house was not a purely negative space. It was a composite of all the parts of her, the good and the bad, the light and the dark. As she moved through the house, Clara noticed that the rooms had changed. The walls were no longer as oppressive, no longer as distorted. They still pulsed with the hum, but it had softened, like the distant thrum of a heartbeat. The rooms seemed less like barriers and more like markers of her journey, each one offering a chance for reflection. She passed the study, where the mirror had once trapped her in an endless loop of self-doubt. Now, as she gazed into it, she saw a different face, a face that looked back at her with a kind of resolve. It was as though the mirror no longer held her captive, but reflected her ability to face herself and move forward. Yet, as Clara continued her walk, she couldn't escape the sense that something was still wrong. Something was still out of balance. The hum had shifted, yes, but there was an undercurrent of tension, a feeling that there was still something she was missing, something lurking just beneath the surface of her awareness. She had begun to understand that the house was not merely a place of suffering. It was a place of possibility. But what kind of possibility? What if confronting her past wasn't enough? What if, despite her best efforts, the house had grown too powerful, too intertwined with her own psyche to be undone by mere acknowledgement? It was then that Clara heard it again, soft, almost imperceptible, a whisper that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Her name, Clara. The sound was not like the hum, nor like her own voice. It was different, faint and hollow. It carried with it an eerie sense of finality, as though the house itself was warning her. Was it a memory? A trick of her mind? Or was it something more sinister, a reflection of the house's true nature, an entity that was more than just a physical space, but a force capable of shaping the very fabric of reality? Clara stopped in her tracks. She wasn't sure whether she wanted to find the source of the whisper or whether she feared it entirely. But she knew one thing for certain. The house, and the choices it embodied, had not released its grip on her yet. It had merely shifted its form. Perhaps she had misunderstood. Perhaps confronting her past was not the end of the journey, but merely the beginning of a deeper confrontation with the very essence of the house itself. She had thought the key to escape lay in understanding, but now she realized that understanding was only the first step. The house had not been built from her choices alone. It had been shaped by something older, something far more ancient, and perhaps far more dangerous. The echo of the house's power reverberated through Clara's bones as she stood frozen in place. There was no longer any doubt. The journey ahead would not be a simple path of redemption. It would be a struggle for control over something that was far more insidious than she had ever imagined. The house was not a passive reflection of her psyche. It was a living, breathing entity, one that had a will of its own. And now, Clara understood that her choices, however powerful they seemed, might not be enough to undo the damage. She was in a battle not just with herself, but with the very force that had grown alongside her, a force that she might not be able to outmaneuver. And as she stood there, she understood the true cost of her journey. It was not just her past that she had to confront, but the very nature of the choices that had brought her here. To survive, to escape, she would have to do something she had never done before, face the consequences of her actions with no guarantee of success. The house would not give her answers. It would only give her one thing, the chance to choose again. Clara stood at the edge of the house, or what she thought was the edge. She wasn't sure anymore, as the walls seemed to stretch and contract, shifting in ways that defied logic. Each time she thought she knew where she was or where she was going, a new corridor opened up, or the old familiar ones twisted into something unrecognizable. The house, this strange manifestation of her fears and desires, was alive, breathing, and adapting, seemingly aware of every thought that passed through her mind. What had begun as a simple reflection of her emotional landscape had morphed into something far more complex. The realization that the house was not just a product of her internal struggles, but a living entity, one that evolved with every step she took, had shaken Clara to her core. This was no longer a place she could escape from by simply facing her past. The house was a reflection of her very essence, and every truth she uncovered about herself seemed to only lead to deeper layers of complexity. The whispers had started again. At first, she had dismissed them as figments of her imagination, perhaps the result of the tension in her mind. But now, as the voices grew clearer and more insistent, Clara began to wonder if they were not just the echoes of her own thoughts. She stopped walking and listened carefully. The whispers seemed to speak in a language she couldn't quite understand, but the urgency in their tone was undeniable. Each syllable reverberated through her, stirring something deep inside her that made her skin crawl. With a mixture of fear and resolve, Clara turned back toward the heart of the house. She had been avoiding the central room for days, unable to bring herself to confront whatever waited there. She had known that there was something hidden in that room, something that had been waiting for her to acknowledge it. But until now, she had not been ready. Now, however, she could feel the pull, something drawing her back to that space, something urging her to face the truth once and for all. As Clara walked down the familiar hallway, the hum of the house grew louder, as if the walls themselves were preparing for something monumental. She reached the door, the one she had avoided for so long, and paused. The handle was cold to the touch, a stark contrast to the warmth that had once filled this house. The door creaked open, revealing the room beyond. At first glance, it seemed like any other, a large, open space with dim lighting and old furniture draped in sheets. Yet as Clara stepped inside, she felt an overwhelming sense of unease, as if the very air in the room was charged with something beyond her understanding. In the center of the room stood a mirror, much larger than the one she had encountered before. It was framed in dark, ornate wood, its surface reflecting a pale, otherworldly light. Clara's heart raced as she approached it, her reflection becoming clearer with each step. But something was wrong. Her reflection was not quite right. It moved in a way that was just a fraction of a second ahead of her own movements, as if it were not quite aligned with the present reality. The longer she stared into the glass, the more distorted her image became, until it was no longer her face staring back at her, but something else. For a moment, Clara's mind faltered. Her breath caught in her throat as her reflection twisted into something unfamiliar, someone else entirely. The face was a grotesque parody of her own, twisted in anger and despair. She stepped back in shock, but the reflection continued to mock her, its eyes burning with an intensity that left her feeling paralyzed. The whispers grew louder, now clearly voices, dozens of them, all speaking in a chorus of desperation and regret. Clara wanted to turn away, but she couldn't. She felt rooted to the spot, unable to escape the gaze of the thing in the mirror. Then, with a sudden shift, the reflection in the mirror changed. The face of the other Clara disappeared, replaced by another image, one far more familiar. It was the face of her mother, or at least a version of her mother, one Clara had never truly known. This version was not the warm, caring figure from her childhood memories, but something far darker, cold, distant, and unforgiving. The woman in the mirror smiled, but it was a smile devoid of warmth, a smile that carried with it a sense of judgment, as if she were waiting for Clara to apologize for something. The room seemed to close in on Clara as she tried to comprehend the image before her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The house, the mirror, the whispers, they were not just manifestations of her own fears. They were pieces of her unresolved past, fragments of relationships and emotions that had been left unaddressed for years. Her mother's face, now twisted and harsh, was not a simple memory. It was a part of Clara, a part of the pain and trauma she had never fully processed. The house, in all its disorienting and shifting complexity, was pulling these fragments to the surface, forcing her to confront them in a way she never had before. Clara's knees buckled beneath her as the weight of this truth overwhelmed her. She had spent so much of her life running from the painful realities of her upbringing, from the difficult and fractured relationship with her mother. She had convinced herself that she had moved beyond it, that she was no longer the scared little girl who had sought approval at any cost. But the house had shown her the truth, that unresolved pain could never truly be buried. It would always resurface, in some form or another, demanding attention, demanding recognition. As she struggled to catch her breath, the voice of her mother spoke, clear and sharp. "You always knew this was coming. You can't outrun what you are." The words echoed through the room, and Clara's reflection seemed to nod in agreement. For the first time, she understood the gravity of the house's presence. It was not simply a place of torment. It was a mirror that reflected not only the past, but the truth about herself she had tried so hard to suppress. In this moment, Clara realized that the house was not just a place to escape. It was the very embodiment of everything she had refused to face. With that understanding came a wave of clarity. The house, the mirror, the whispers, they were not trying to break her. They were trying to wake her up, to force her to reckon with the parts of herself she had long ignored. And as the room around her began to settle, as the reflections slowly returned to their natural state, Clara made a choice. She would no longer run from the past, from the pain, or from the difficult truths. The house had given her a chance, an opportunity to confront everything she had been avoiding. And for the first time, she felt ready to face it head-on. The room quieted, the whispers fading as Clara turned away from the mirror. The house had not released her yet, but perhaps in this moment, she had found the key to unlocking its grip. And as she stepped forward, deeper into the labyrinth of her own mind, she understood that the journey was far from over. The house would continue to challenge her, but she no longer feared it. She was no longer afraid of the truths it revealed, for she now knew that only by embracing them could she ever hope to escape. The house had changed again. Clara could feel it in the air, the way the temperature seemed to fluctuate, the way the silence between the walls seemed to pulse with an unspoken urgency. It was as though the house itself was waiting for her to make the next move, but Clara didn't know what that move should be. She had faced the mirror, she had confronted her past, and she had thought she was ready to leave the maze of her own mind. But the more she navigated this house, the more she realized it wasn't as simple as just confronting her fears and moving on. The house was far more complex than that. It was not a place she could conquer with just one revelation. It required an understanding that was deeper, more nuanced, one that Clara wasn't sure she was ready to embrace. As she wandered through the now familiar, ever-shifting hallways, the weight of her decision started to sink in. The realization that she had to confront not just the events of her past, but the entire foundation of her identity was daunting. The house wasn't just a reflection of her trauma. It was a manifestation of her life's tangled threads. Every moment, every relationship, every choice that had led her to this point. The more Clara explored, the more she could feel the complexity of the situation pressing in on her, its implications wrapping around her like a suffocating net. She wasn't just dealing with fragmented memories anymore. The house was a web of her own creation, one she had woven through years of fear, guilt, and unresolved emotions. Her footsteps echoed through the corridor, but the sound seemed muffled, as if the house itself was absorbing her presence, drawing her into its depths. Clara found herself in a new room, one that she didn't recognize at first. The walls were adorned with faded photographs, images of her childhood, her family, her past. But something was wrong with them. The faces in the photographs were distorted, stretched, like the memories themselves were being twisted and manipulated by some unseen force. The people in the images weren't just her family. They were versions of herself, distorted and altered, as if they had been through 1,000 iterations, 1,000 versions of her own emotional experiences. It was unsettling to see these images come to life in such an unnatural way. In the center of the room stood an old wooden chest, its lid slightly ajar. Clara was drawn to it, a magnetic pull she couldn't explain. There was something in the chest that she needed to see, something that felt both familiar and foreign at the same time. Her hands trembled as she opened the lid. Inside, she found an assortment of objects, letters, keepsakes, and small trinkets that seemed to have no particular significance at first glance. But as Clara sifted through the items, a sense of recognition washed over her. Each object, though seemingly random, represented a moment in her life, a snapshot of a time when something important had shifted. These were the moments she had tried to forget, the moments she had pushed aside because they were too painful to face. One item in particular caught her attention, a small, tarnished key. It was unlike any key Clara had ever seen, its design intricate and strange. As her fingers closed around it, a sudden wave of emotion flooded her, and she was overcome with a sharp, vivid memory. She was standing in the living room of her childhood home, watching her mother place the key on a shelf. Clara had asked her mother what it was for, but she had never received an answer. It had always been an object of curiosity, something that Clara had never been allowed to touch. Now, as she held it in her hand, Clara realized that the key was more than just an object. It was a symbol of something locked away, something hidden from her. The moment she touched the key, the room around her seemed to shift again. The photographs on the walls began to move, their faces twisting, their eyes following her every move. The air became thick, heavy with the presence of something watching, waiting. Clara's heart began to race. She felt like she was on the brink of discovering something monumental, something that could shatter everything she thought she knew. The house was no longer just a reflection of her inner turmoil. It was a living, breathing entity, and Clara had just unlocked another layer of its complex nature. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut behind her, and the house seemed to groan, as if it were awakening from a long slumber. The photographs on the walls stopped moving, but the key in Clara's hand began to pulse with an eerie energy, as if it were calling her to action. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, the air growing colder and more oppressive. It was as though the house had been waiting for her to uncover this particular memory, to uncover this key. The realization hit Clara like a tidal wave. There was more to this house, more to the game it was playing, than she could have ever imagined. The key was a piece of a larger puzzle, and until she understood its significance, the house would never let her go. Clara's pulse quickened as she realized that the house wasn't simply a reflection of her emotions or memories. It was a test. Every step she took, every decision she made, was part of an intricate challenge, a challenge to face the darkest parts of herself. The key was not just a physical object. It was a symbol of her deepest fears, the things she had locked away from herself. The house was not trying to break her. It was trying to teach her, to force her to confront the parts of herself she had always avoided. The door to the room rattled, the sound of something banging against it from the other side. Clara took a deep breath and turned toward the door. The the key still clutched tightly in her hand. The photographs had stopped moving, the walls had stopped shifting, but the tension in the room remained palpable. The house was waiting for her to make a choice, to take the next step. She could leave, return to the safety of the known hallways and rooms, where she could face whatever lay beyond the door. She could run, or she could confront whatever had been hidden in the recesses of her mind for so long. In the silence that followed, Clara made her decision. With a steady hand, she placed the key into the lock and turned it. As the door creaked open, the room beyond revealed itself, but Clara couldn't yet understand what it meant. All she knew was that she had crossed another threshold in her journey, and the house was waiting to reveal yet another layer of the truth. What awaited her on the other side was something she would soon have to face, whether she was ready or not. The house had opened a new door, but now it was up to her to walk through it. Clara stepped through the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The space beyond was unlike anything she had encountered within the house so far. It was an expansive, open area, almost cathedral-like in its grandeur. But the grandeur felt unnatural, like an illusion made to disorient her. The walls were lined with mirrors, tall, antique mirrors, each one reflecting a slightly different version of the same scene. In each reflection, Clara saw herself, but the image was subtly different each time. Her posture changed, her expression flickered, and at times, her reflection seemed to look back at her with a strange knowingness. It was as if the mirrors were not just reflecting her physical form, but were also showing her inner self, the parts of her that had remained hidden and locked away for so long. As Clara stepped further into the room, the air seemed to grow heavier, denser, like the space itself was breathing with her. She moved cautiously, her eyes scanning the mirrors, trying to understand what she was seeing. Each reflection distorted her image in different ways. Some stretched her figure unnaturally, while others fragmented her into multiple versions of herself, each holding a different expression or posture. It was an unsettling experience, as though the house was mocking her sense of self, questioning who she truly was. The deeper she walked into the room, the more the mirrors seemed to whisper to her. She could hear soft, unintelligible murmurs, as if voices were coming from within the reflections. It was not just the sound of whispers. It was as though the mirrors were alive, sentient, and trying to communicate with her. The voices seemed to call her by name, beckoning her to approach them, to peer closer into the glass and see what they wanted to show her. But Clara hesitated. She had learned not to trust the house, not to trust the illusions it presented. And yet there was something about this room, something magnetic, that compelled her to keep moving forward. As she reached the center of the room, she noticed that the mirrors were not just reflections of her image. There was something else, something hidden in the glass. At first, Clara couldn't tell what it was, but as she leaned closer to one of the mirrors, the image in the glass began to shift. It was no longer just her reflection. Instead, she saw a vision, a scene from her past, one she had long forgotten. It was a memory of her mother, her face full of worry, standing in the doorway of Clara's childhood home. Clara had been a teenager then, rebellious and distant, unwilling to listen to her mother's concerns. The memory was vivid, almost too real, and Clara could feel the weight of her mother's gaze, the unspoken words that had hung between them. For a moment, Clara was paralyzed. The memory was not just a flash of the past. It was a confrontation. The house was forcing her to face her relationship with her mother, to confront the unresolved tension that had lingered between them. Clara had spent years avoiding the pain of that relationship, but now, in the presence of these mirrors, it was impossible to escape. The house wasn't just showing her memories. It was unraveling the threads of her past, revealing the places where her heart had been broken, where she had been too afraid to face the truth. The mirrors began to shimmer, and the room felt as though it was spinning. Clara blinked, trying to regain her focus, but the image in the mirror shifted again. This time it wasn't just her mother. It was a scene of her younger self, sitting in her bedroom, crying into her hands. Clara's heart twisted as she watched the memory play out in front of her. The tears she had shed in her youth, the pain she had buried deep within her. It was all there, laid bare in the reflection. The girl in the mirror was her, but it was also someone she no longer recognized, someone she had tried to forget. As the images continued to change, Clara could see flashes of her other relationships, her failed friendships, her broken promises, the time she had betrayed herself. Each reflection was a reminder of how she had distanced herself from the people she loved, how she had retreated into herself, building walls that had kept others out. The mirrors were showing her the truth she had avoided, the pain she had never allowed herself to fully feel. It was overwhelming, the weight of all that history pressing in on her from every angle. But then something shifted in the room. The mirrors that had once reflected only her past began to change. Now, the reflections showed her future, fragmented glimpses of what might come, what could be. Clara saw herself standing at a crossroads, her face filled with uncertainty. She saw versions of herself that were still broken, still struggling to reconcile the pieces of her past. But she also saw a version of herself that was whole, at peace with the choices she had made, someone who had learned to forgive herself. The contrast was stark, jarring. Clara didn't know how to make sense of it. The room was silent now, the murmurs from the mirrors gone. Clara stood in the center, trying to absorb the overwhelming flood of emotions that had been stirred up. The house had forced her to confront her past, to face the pain she had tried to bury for so long. But now, as she looked at the future that lay before her, Clara realized that the true challenge wasn't in confronting the past. It was in understanding how to move forward. The house had shown her the broken pieces, the things she had done wrong, but it had also given her a glimpse of the potential for healing, for transformation. Clara knew that the journey was far from over. The house had opened a door to her past, but it had also opened a door to her future. She had seen the darkness that had shaped her, but she had also seen the possibility of something better. The real test, she realized, wasn't in how she had lived before. It was in how she chose to live now. The echoes of her past would always be with her, but they didn't have to define her. The house had shown her that truth, and now it was up to Clara to choose how she would move forward. As the room around her seemed to settle into stillness, Clara knew that the final confrontation was coming. The house had laid bare everything she needed to understand, but the choice was hers. Would she accept the painful truths of her past and embrace the possibility of change? Or would she allow the house to keep her trapped in its labyrinth, forever haunted by what could have been? She wasn't sure yet, but one thing was clear. The journey had reached its breaking point, and soon she would have to decide whether to break free or remain imprisoned by her own fear. Clara stood at the threshold of the final room, a place that seemed to pulse with an energy that was both inviting and terrifying. The door, though still closed, seemed to hum with an invisible force, as if it were waiting for her to make the first move. Behind it, Clara knew, lay the ultimate confrontation, the culmination of everything the house had shown her. She had seen the reflections, the echoes of her past, and glimpses of her potential future. Now, standing on the brink, she understood that it was time to choose. The house had been a mirror, showing her not just who she had been, but who she could still become. For weeks, the house had led her through its labyrinth, each room designed to test her, to expose her fears and insecurities. At first, Clara had thought it was a punishment, an endless cycle of torment, pushing her towards some cruel, inevitable end. But now, standing at the final threshold, she realized that it wasn't punishment at all. The house was not her enemy. It was a teacher, one that had forced her to face truths she had long ignored. It had shown her the cracks in her soul, the broken pieces she had tried to hide from herself. But more than that, it had also shown her the possibility of healing, the potential for growth. Clara had spent much of her life running from herself, avoiding the pain that came with self-reflection, with facing the choices she had made. But now, she had no choice but to confront it all. The past, with its moments of failure, regret, and heartbreak, was not something she could change. It had shaped her, molded her into the person she was, but it did not have to define her future. She had spent so much time blaming herself, believing she was unworthy of happiness, of peace. But as the house had revealed to her, those feelings were not truths. They were illusions. The real truth lay in the choices she made from this moment forward. The door before her creaked open, and Clara stepped across the threshold. The room inside was unlike anything she had encountered in the house before. It was not a mirror, not a reflection of the past or future, but an empty space, a void. The floor was bare, the walls were blank, and the air felt light, almost weightless. It was as though the room existed outside of time, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. Clara felt the weight of her breath, the pounding of her heart, as if the very essence of her being was suspended in this moment. In the center of the room, there was a small pedestal, upon which rested a single object, a mirror. It was small, no larger than a handheld compact, yet it radiated an energy that felt both familiar and foreign. Clara approached it cautiously, her eyes drawn to its surface. As she gazed into the mirror, she didn't see her reflection. Instead, she saw a version of herself, older, wiser, and at peace. This reflection was not distorted or broken, but whole. There was a calmness in her eyes, a sense of understanding that Clara had never known. This version of herself was smiling, not because she had achieved perfection, but because she had accepted her imperfections. She had embraced the parts of herself that she had once tried to hide, the mistakes she had made, and the lessons she had learned. The reflection in the mirror was not someone Clara was trying to become, but someone she already was, if only she allowed herself to see it. Clara reached out, her fingers brushing the mirror's surface. The instant she made contact, the reflection shifted. She saw herself standing at a crossroads, much like in the earlier visions, but now there was no uncertainty in her eyes. She knew exactly which path to take. It wasn't a path that would be free from hardship or pain, but it was a path that was hers to choose. For the first time, Clara understood that her life was not dictated by fate, by the house, or by anyone else. It was hers to live. The mirror seemed to pulse in her hand, and for a moment, Clara saw flashes of the past again, her childhood, her strained relationships, the broken promises. But this time, they didn't overwhelm her. Instead, they felt like distant echoes, no longer as sharp or painful. She had carried those memories with her for so long, letting them shape her into someone she wasn't meant to be. But now, they were simply part of her story, not the whole of it. She had the power to rewrite the ending. As Clara stood there, holding the mirror in her hands, she realized that the house had given her the gift of choice. It had shown her the fractured pieces of herself, but it had also shown her the potential to heal, to grow, to move beyond the pain. The house had pushed her to confront the darkest corners of her mind, but now it was up to her to decide what to do with what she had learned. She could choose to keep running from her past, to remain trapped in the cycle of regret and fear, or she could choose to face the future with open arms, free from the weight of her old wounds. The door to the room closed behind her, and the house fell silent. Clara stood alone, but not truly alone. She carried within her the lessons of everything she had faced in the house, the strength to move beyond her mistakes, the wisdom to forgive herself, and the courage to choose a different path. The house had done its work. Now, it was up to Clara to live the life she had always been capable of. The mirror in her hands began to glow, its light filling the room with a warm, golden radiance. Clara smiled, not because she had all the answers, but because she had finally found the peace she had been searching for. The house had shown her who she was, who she had been, and who she could be. Now, it was time to step into the world, to face whatever came next, and to live her life fully, no longer haunted by the past, but free to create a future of her own making. And so, with the mirror in hand, Clara took the first step toward her new life. The house had given her the gift of self-acceptance, and now it was time to embrace it. The echoes of the past faded behind her, and she stepped into the light of a future that was hers to define.